Nato, the next war in Europe. Alrighty, what can we say? This game's got some interesting contradictions in it. First off, it utterly fails what it was first designed to do. Its initial intention was to be kind of purely a simple player's game, right? And it kept some of that flavor in it. A game that, in terms of the map and the counters, isn't too far from what you'd expect from an S&T magazine of the time immediately preceding it. The quality, about on that level. The only differences is coming with the player aids card, standard kind of Victory Games quality in terms of glossy counters that are kind of pretty, although they have the side nubs, which are a bitch and a half to clip. And a somewhat larger rule book, a few more counters, just a little bit more. That kind of, to me, edges it into, well, you're selling this as a boxed game for $20 instead of a magazine game for $2.50, or $5 if you bought it on the stand. So to me, that kind of raises the bar on it from what I would give as a rating for, say, an S&T magazine game. And in terms of utterly failing as a player's game, here's why. Because it is completely balanced, but only if you do completely silly types of things at the beginning of the game. Things that get rid of the whole point behind the game, which is namely, it's an absolutely balanced game if NATO drops nukes on turn 2. And if they do not, I am convinced it's heavily, heavily weighted against them. I would have said unwinnable by them, except that I think I won a game, so at the very least, I got it so that the Warsaw Pact victory was more limited than we were seeing in this game, where we could pretty much say, okay, it's over. There's just no way that NATO is going to stop the Pact. I think that covers I think it covers all three of the scenarios. But I'm not absolutely certain about the tactical surprise scenario. I've probably played that at most once. This one I only played maybe at most once as well. But it's so clearly reflected, and my memory fits so well what I saw out of most of my playings of it, which I think were with the largest scenario, that I can pretty much say with a surety, if I'm playing NATO, I am going to admit, in a competitive game, I'm going to admit I can't win, and I'm going to throw the nukes. However, it is kind of interesting in a simulation quality, which was eventually one of the goals taken on. The designer notes that, hey, when I first looked at this design, I wanted to make a player's game and kind of beer and pretzel, and then I decided you couldn't do that and do the subject matter any justice whatsoever. And that's pretty much my feeling about most war games. This still ends up being a fairly light treatment. One map and not too much detail in the rules. I think these rules, although they take 36 pages in Victory Games font and kind of what feels like somewhat questionable quality, especially for Victory Games. Some weird aspects like these numbered paragraphs everywhere that don't follow the normal numbering system, etc. That's okay. But I think they could have probably squeezed this into a big issue, a heavier component issue in an S&T. Something like Sicily was done with larger amounts of components. And I think this could probably fit into something along those lines. Maybe a once a year kind of, here's your present for a bonus release. It certainly doesn't feel like a game that underwent 3 years of development like it says it did, with significant playtesting for balance. I just feel like most competitive players are gonna walk away from this saying, okay, this is completely uninteresting. Now, as someone who leans more in the simulation camp, I find it very disturbing because the victory conditions are there and they feel like they should direct me. Now, maybe I'm just not competent at the game, at playing the defense with NATO, or maybe I'm missing some major rule, but again and again I've come to this same conclusion, that this game just is not balanced unless, even remotely balanced, unless you throw those nukes on turn 2. And if you do that, it's absolutely balanced. Warsaw Pact will lose because you will knock out their capability to move forward, or you'll lose because you failed on the die roll on turn 2. 50-50 chance. Still, if if those nuke rules weren't in, I don't know how much I'd gripe about it, to tell you the truth. I'd kind of look at it as that simulation game. But the fact that they're there, the fact that you're allowed to use the TAC nukes, and that they have the effects they do in the game, brings it to whatever competitive part in me there is, I really want to use the nukes as soon as the border's crossed. And I kind of don't see the point to the game because of that one rule. If you threw that rule out completely, I would say you've got a nice, unbalanced, light simulation game. And under those conditions, I think it would hold my interest just a little bit more than it has, because it does actually give a nice representational view of what those first couple weeks would be like on a much, much higher plane than you'll see in a couple of the other World War III simulations that I've seen. And for that, this really hits the spot. My mindset doesn't allow me to accept that as a success, though, for whatever reason. Anyway, that's the biggie in it. There are some weirdnesses in it. The rules, you get a lot of rich stuff in it. The board, it looks like it was designed by Simmons. It is just beautiful. Who is it? Ted Kohler did the map? Yeah, Ted Kohler did the graphics on this. And he's, learned everything from Simonson in this and done a fantastic job on the map. The only problems, a little bit faint hex numbers, hard to find where something is because of that. I'm also finding with my eyes, I'm having trouble reading some of the counter designations, especially the hex numbers on the counters. Begin to see why games put the locations in rule books instead of right on the counters as I get older. It's nice to have a box. The box art is nice. Boy, was I excited when I picked this one up, because Central Front Series was just a little too big for my table at that point. So I had to play it out in the garage on a humongous work table type thing, and I'm crawling around on top of this. I guess I could play on the floor, but I had stupid carpeting like I do here. So that was very, very difficult for me to bring out, and it was a little much. This is my size game, for this kind of thing that I'm not terribly interested in, or World War II or whatever. This is the size I want to cope with. In fact, maybe it's kind of the size I want to cope with for most things. I kind of get a kick out of when I set up an SPQR or whatever. And I'm kind of dreading doing another of the Great Battles, Great Leaders series, because they're just a little too big, at least for the tactical. I think my tolerance for these bigger the bigger games has kind of faded. So this is, a nice size game. You could probably play it in one sitting pretty easily. Even the long game in a longer sitting, whatever. You're starting to see player aid cards. This is, this is a period where almost modern expectations are beginning to be developed. And in a lot of ways, Victory Games can be blamed for that. That's a lot of why Victory Games continues to be well rated, well reviewed, well seen, is they seem to have gotten everything kind of right throughout their games. Now, like I said, the rules in this, I'm a little grumpy about them. I think they tend to make choices between putting something in the player aid or the rule book, but not both. I prefer to see it in both places so that when I read the rules without looking at the player aids, I can understand the flow of the game, and then when I look at the player aid, I can link it back to the rules more easily and then find things I need to look up. The rules aren't terribly complicated, but I found myself having to do a lot of lookups in this game and also screwing up and missing a couple of things, which is not surprising for me, but you know. So overall, because of its failure as kind of a player's game, I've always, you know, in terms of the balance, the competitive side, I've always rated this a little lower and viewed it a little lower than maybe I would if it hadn't had that one rule about the nukes in it. I see some people play without it. Well, then it becomes kind of this unbalanced, lighter simulation, and I think it does very, very well in that aspect. And it's not like you couldn't tinker the victory points or use a bidding system on them in order to better reflect, you know, the weakness of the NATO player. I would love to sit down with somebody who is really competent at this game and could show me a successful defense for NATO using the victory conditions in the game. Those victory conditions definitely do provide you with an incentive to play historically as NATO, or reasonably as NATO, in the sense of trying to defend further forward than other victory conditions would. And that's one of the things. If you threw bidding into it, and you had someone like me at least defending as NATO, I think you would end up with a fairly high bid for the, you know, saying how much the Warsaw Pact has to get in victory conditions, and a tendency to defend further back than you need, than this design forces you to do. That forward defense is really part of the NATO doctrine, not right at the border, but that you're not going to just give up Germany entirely. Some of that has to do with the reforger units and the territorial units being called up. But some of it has to do with that victory point requirement, that you'd give up cities, etc., fairly easily. So, that tactical doctrine only makes sense if you're going to throw the nukes. And maybe the game provides you with that really good simulation, but there's a lot of game here that you wouldn't use if you follow what almost follows as has to be the NATO tactical doctrine in this game. And once you start lobbing nukes, it's over one way or the other. You didn't really get to see that in the playthrough. I could have played it out a little longer, but you know, honestly, there was so little left for the pack to take that it didn't really matter to me. But yeah, they stop dead once those headquarters are knocked out, and they're starting to see their units attrition at just too high a level in that highly nuclearly charged environment. So, you know, kind of never met my expectations of the game. I kind of thought it would be as good a simulation as it is, but also an interesting game. Central Front series makes the nukes somewhat less effective as a defensive power, kind of assumes them. It just says, all right, NATO's going to come forward, but they aren't going to stop the Warsaw Pact as easily. This, I think, actually probably is a better simulation for the simple fact that, you know what? You start lobbing those tactical nukes, and I bet you that battlefield wasn't going to progress. You know, I think this game actually represents that quite well. It just isn't terribly interesting to watch. And there's no in-between level.
I guess you could house rule some things. Say those Warsaw Pact units have more capacity to keep going forward once the headquarters are knocked out. But I find that kind of unbelievable too. I think the battlefield that you'd see with modern units and Warsaw Pact training, which was not even in their Category 1 divisions, was not that high. I think those units would just fall apart under that kind of pressure. And I think this game represents that very, very nicely. That's just not an interesting scenario to play. That's the most likely scenario. And Central Front gets around that by saying, all right, we're going to say the TAC nukes aren't quite as effective as you think they are. Which is a reasonable assumption, you know. It's just, the truth is, World War III in Europe probably isn't that interesting to play out as tactical simulation. It might be more interesting to, as an operational or strategic level simulation. It might actually be more interesting to play out some tactical battles, because no matter what the situation, there are going to be interesting tactical fights in a modern conflict. And that's why, of course, things like ASL are interesting. No matter who's winning on which front, there are always examples you could pull up and play out, especially when you're doing, you know, these representational battles that there's no real historic precedent for the exact situation that's being fought. Well, those kind of games can do quite well. But something like this, it's tough. You're also not going to see the kind of East Front World War II situation. First of all, the time frame's too small, and secondly, it's really hard to project what would happen. You know, you can't project it out to 6 months or something like that, where NATO might actually be landing significant ground forces on the field. Anyway, those are my thoughts on this one. It didn't present me with an interesting enough game to sort of capture my attention in it. And maybe that Third World War as a simulation just isn't interesting enough either to capture my interest. All I can do is kind of get interested in that fantasy scenario that's presented in Central Front, which is either the don't use nukes or try, nukes won't get used, or try to, you know, make some kind of weird house rule to limit their effectiveness and match it more to Central Front series. One other thing I wanted to touch on was the chemical weapons. So here again, victory points, the victory conditions in this actually fail me as a simulation. Which is to say, I don't think they're worth the points that the Warsaw Pact player has to spend or give up to use them. They're a powerful factor, but that power wears out pretty quickly. What they might be valuable in is to try to get that hump, over that hump of decisive victory really early before NATO decides to use nukes, if you're playing against a NATO player who's unwilling to use nukes. The problem with them is, though, because they cost you 1 or 2 victory points every single damn turn, you're looking at a significant increase in the number of victory points you're going to pay. And the designer himself indicates there is no political strategic reason why Warsaw Pact wouldn't use chemical warfare. That the NATO troops aren't well enough trained or equipped in chemical weaponry, or biological perhaps, for them to actually turn and use them against Warsaw Pact as a secondary use. Now, we maintained, and probably still do, as far as I know, a significant amount of chemical and biological weaponry. We just didn't deploy it with the troops or train them in their use. So its deterrent factor is kind of, okay, why are you doing that? The big deterrent factor, and that there was, you know, significant training in, was in the nuclear side. And that that would be the one reason you wouldn't use it. And there again, is NATO going to be sufficiently pushed over the edge by the use of chemical warfare to use nuclear? Or is the invasion itself sufficient to convince them to use an attack nuke first strike? Hard to tell. My feeling is they would use it right away. That immediately you'd see that technique. And again, somewhat subjective. You see a particular picture of the war that I think is actually quite accurate, except for that victory point penalty for the chemical weapons. That's the one. That's the one thing that I object to for as a simulation, is when you put that into play. You're looking, and the victory points serve well in the simulation in terms of forcing NATO to defend more forward than they would want to, if the victory point requirements were greater on the Warsaw Pact. Anyway, there you have it. Once again, let's send this one out.